Arizona Territory, autumn 1879. The wind came down off the Mogollon Rim, carrying cedar smoke and the bite of early cold. The eastbound coach sighed at the depot like a tired animal and rolled away, leaving dust to hang in the moonlight, and one woman standing still as a fence post in an empty yard. I was there on account of fence wire and a broken shovel head, not romance. Ash Fork wasn't much half a street of false fronts, a water tank, and the kind of silence that starts arguments in a man's skull. I had no business watching the coach at all, but the way she stepped down made me take off my hat careful, like every plank might give way, like she'd been disappointed by floors before. She kept one gloved hand in her pocket as if it held heat. The other clutched a carpet bag that had been honest with the road. When she looked around, hope did what it always does out here. It checked for witnesses before braking. The agent leaned out the window. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" She nodded once. "Yes, sir. A man who said his name was Brennan." The name slid across the yard like a snake. I'd heard it in saloon talk, Thomas Brennan, prospector of more claims than strikes. I didn't say so. It ain't kind to tie a rock to a drowning person. I meant to mind my errands. But the agent pointed toward me. "Boone there knows every cabin from here to Sycamore. If your fella's running late, he'll know the reason." I did what men do when strangers hand them trouble. I pretended it was a chore. "Elias Boone," I said. "If Brennan's up, Canyon, he ain't in town. We can ride out and see." Her mouth steadied like a line pulled taut. "I'm Lydia Hart." The vowel of Missouri still hung on her name. She said it like a promise no court had witnessed yet. I saddled my buckskin and borrowed the agent's bay for her. She rode like a woman who had paid for the lesson with bruises and kept riding anyway. The rim threw long blue shadows as we left the tracks. Pinon and juniper made a dark comb against the sky. We took the wagon road that clawed toward Sycamore Wash, the hooves knocking talk out of both of us. She spoke first. "He wrote of a cabin, a garden, said he'd have coffee on." "Men say things when they're lonesome," I said. "Sometimes they even mean them." She let that sit. "I left a factory where air came black. I can stand dust and quiet. I can stand a lot if a man tells the truth." We topped the last rise, and there it was. A single-room box with a stovepipe, a cut of garden dead to frost, a door that didn't meet the jamb. No smoke, no prints but wind. I swung down, tied the reins to a cedar branch, and pushed the door with 2 fingers. It went in on a sigh. The room smelled like old sweat and mouse. A shirt hung on a nail, cuffs frayed where a man rubs worry into cloth. The bed was unmade in a way that said, "Yesterday, not this morning." Then I heard it, the kind of sound that makes a hard place inside a man crack, a mewling that wasn't cat. Small, hungry, honest. She moved faster than I did, found the wooden crate by the hearth, bent, and came up with a bundle. The baby blinked like light hurt. Dark hair, eyes the Mexico blue the sky wears after rain. He didn't cry proper, he saved his breath like he'd learned the cost. "Josiah," she said without thinking, and then glanced at me as if caught stealing. He needed a name. "Names have weight," I said. "Give him one if you mean to carry him." She squared her shoulders, and I knew she'd already been carrying heavier things. We looked a long minute. There was a bottle on the table, dried lines of milk like old maps. No coal in the scuttle, a pan with flies. "Brennan left," I said, "because lies don't buy wood. There's a spring on my place and goats. We'll take the boy there." She wanted to protest properness, arrangements, whatever cities demand, but the baby's mouth opened on a dry cry and settled it. We wrapped him in a blanket that had known better days and better soap, and we lit out. On the way down, Canyon, the wind changed. Juniper bowed like churchgoers. I tasted metal and looked east. A wall of cloud was pulling itself over the rim, thick and black, the kind that births lightning quick as a lie. "Monsoon," I said. "Keep the bay's head up." We made the lower bench as the first drops hit fat, warm, troublesome. My place is 2 rooms knocked together around a stove, big enough to be a friend in January. The porch lists. The roof keeps most promises. I got the door open, shoved her inside with the baby, and went to uncinch saddles fast. The sky split white. Thunder put its boot on our roof and pushed. The wash in front of the house went from polite trickle to brown mussel in 1 minute. When the water wants the land, it takes it. I ran feed sacks to the low door, dropped the bars on the corral gate, and turned to see a shape on the ridge, 3 coyotes watching with the patience of undertakers. Inside, the room got small with worry and wet wool. I set a kettle, brought down the goat milk, and watched her test the heat on her wrist like she'd done it 100 times. The boy latched, the kind of relief that unknots an entire house. Only then did she shake. It started in the hands, went to the shoulders, took the jaw last. She put her head down so I wouldn't have to see it. I pretended to fuss with the stove like a man does when the right thing is to stand near. "Thank you," she said, voice steadying itself the way a rider finds the saddle again. "I had a letter. He wrote pretty words." "Pretty words are cheaper than roofing nails," I said. "Both are loud when they fail." Lightning hit a cottonwood upriver, and the sound got there before the flash finished dying. The goats bawled like they remembered wolves. I stepped out to look the fence line over and nearly ran into Sheriff Harlan riding hell for leather, with a slicker flapping behind him like a bad idea. "You hear about Brennan?" he shouted through the rain. "I hear his cabin's empty and his baby ain't," I said. "Figures. Boston kin sent a wire. Sister Eveline Brennan. She's got paper from the territorial bench. Claims the boy. She'll be in on the afternoon train tomorrow if the track ain't underwater." He peered past me. "That her? That's Lydia Hart. The boy's wet and hungry, that's all I know." Harlan shifted in the saddle. "Keep 'em indoors. Flood's gonna take the lower road. I'll send Doc Talbot when this lets up." He tipped his hat and disappeared into the gray like a good intention. The rest of the afternoon was made of small works. Cutting kindling, boiling rags, finding one clean jar in a house run by a man. I set Lydia by the stove where steam could lay its warm hands on her. She held Josiah upright, as if gravity had a grudge. When he slept like a soldier, one ear open. After dark, the storm laid down and the coyotes sang their little funeral hymn. I sat on the hearth with my coffee and my ghosts. She watched the flame like she could read its future. "You have family, Mr. Boone?" "I had a brother once," I said, "and a horse I loved better than some men love their wives. The war took one, winter took the other. That. I had a mother who ironed hope into my hair," she said. "She died in a room with too many other women and not enough air." She smoothed the baby's blanket. "A foreman's hand once thought my mouth was his. I left while I still had my name. We were quiet after that. Truth is like a storm once it breaks. You don't talk over it much." Doc Talbot came near midnight, smelling of wintergreen and pipe ash. His hands are a map of the territory, every vein and scar a road. He weighed the boy, frowned at his ribs, nodded at his eyes. "He'll do, if milk keeps coming and fools keep out." He looked at Lydia with that old man's kindness that is almost cruel. "And you, miss, need sleep. 2 hours at a clip, by God's order." He eyed me next. "You keep water sweet, stove fed, and men with opinions off this porch. Eveline Brennan will bring paper. Paper burns at a lower temperature than bone. Remember that and you'll be fine." Lo. When he left, the house felt bigger and smaller. I lay on the floor with a blanket and my rifle, the rain ticking itself out on the roof. I didn't sleep. Men who've watched a river take a calf don't sleep the night after. Morning woke clean and cold. The world smelled scrubbed. Lydia stepped onto the porch with the boy against her shoulder. The light found her the way light finds a thing it wants to keep. She looked at the hills like a juror examining evidence. "I don't want to steal a child, Mr. Boone, but I won't abandon him to anyone's fine house if stone hearts live there." "You don't steal what you've saved," I said. "You claim it." At noon, Sheriff Harlan came back the driveway, and behind him rode a woman whose horse cost more than my place. She wore Boston in her back and something like grief in her mouth. The papers in her satchel rustled like autumn. "Mr. Boone," she said, "I am Eveline Brennan. I've come for my nephew." Her eyes worked over Lydia, over the porch, over the wash that had eaten half my fence. She took in everything a banker takes in when deciding which barn burns first. "The boy's asleep," Lydia said, and the way she stood made it true even if it wasn't. Eveline produced documents with all the authority Inc. can muster this far from its origin. The seal was real. The words were precise. Harlan gave me a look that said, "Don't be stupid, but don't be soft." "Ma'am," I said, "paper is a trail. A child is a campfire. You follow one, you tend the other. If you'd come to warm your hands, you're welcome. If you came to pour water, you'll need more than that satchel." Her face flickered anger first, then something older. "I raised my brother after our parents died," she said, voice steady the way a bridge pretends it doesn't feel the river. "I failed him. I mean to do better by his son." "Doing better starts with looking," I said. "Look." We let her in. She saw the kettle, the goat milk, the line of tiny shirts I'd strung like prayer flags, the way Lydia's hand never left the baby, even in sleep. She saw my floor where I'd spent the night. She saw my rifle leaned up, but safe, and my Bible under the window with dust on it, just enough to be honest. She looked at the picture of my brother I keep by the clock and didn't ask. Outside, the church bell rang twice the signal the schoolmarm uses when the little ones get loose on the road. Then the shout came raw and close. "Fire at the depot." We moved without asking who was in charge. Harlan spurred straight for the water tank. I handed Lydia the sling, and she tucked the baby in like she'd been born with it. Eveline gathered her skirts with a sound of silk, conceding to work. We ran. The freight shed was a square of heat and fear. The tar roof blistered, the west wall already yawed. Buckets lined from the tank to the door and made no difference the way a map makes no difference to a flood. Someone yelled about blasting powder in a crate. The word powder moves through a crowd like a match. "Schoolhouse," Lydia said, and I followed her eyes. One window, 3 faces inside, white with smoke. "Doors jammed," the schoolmarm screamed from outside. Her hands were raw where hope had already bled. "I'll take the sill," I told Eveline. "You get glass." She didn't argue. She picked up a rock like a Boston lady shouldn't know how and made the window choose to be helpful. Lydia went low under the smoke, came up with a child under each arm, like the fact of them made her stronger. I hauled the last kid out by his suspenders while the roof let go in a piece big enough to mean trouble. We fell into the dirt together, coughing. The children coughed back to life, which is the best sound a town ever hears. When a man stops for breath after a fire, he takes inventory. I counted 3 kids, 2 women, 1 town, still here. Eveline looked at Lydia like a judge who just heard testimony the law never wrote down. The papers in her satchel didn't change weight, but something else did. "Mr. Boone," she said quiet, "may I see my nephew?" "On this porch, in this light," I said. "If the boy smiles, we'll talk about the rest." We walked back slow, the way men do who've spent parts of themselves and want to be sure they spent them right. On the porch, Josiah woke and made the soft sound babies make when the world proves it still has a morning in it. He saw Lydia first and relaxed, then turned his blue at Eveline and studied her in a way that made grown people stand straighter. Eveline put one finger out like she was greeting a king. He latched it, decided it belonged, and kicked once. The woman's face changed like weather breaking. No papers argued with that. "Then we'll talk," she said. "Not Boston talk. Ashfork talk." I poured coffee. The day had been long enough to earn honesty. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Pressure lines tighten. First person, Elias Boone. By afternoon, the town wore that ripped look places get after fire, edges curled, faces smoked, everybody speaking in undertones like Sunday had arrived early and unwelcome. Eveline Brennan stacked her papers on my table like a gambler laying down kings. Lydia set Josiah in the sling and tied the knot a little higher, same as a sailor who knows rough water's coming. 10 days, Eveline said. The court will expect me back in Prescott with the child or an explanation more persuasive than sentiment. 10 days cuts a neat groove, I told her. Plenty of time to be decent, not enough to be clever. She studied my stove the way a city woman studies a timetable like it might betray her. "Mr. Boone, I carry responsibility like some men carry whiskey. It warms even while it burns. I won't pretend I haven't come to take him, but I saw what I saw today." Fire peels, paint, and pride, I said. "Leaves timber. We'll work with timber." Doc Talbot arrived with a satchel of jars and the sort of authority only white hair and good hands give. He checked Josiah, weighed him with a scale made of twine and stubbornness, and wrote in a little book, "If there's to be law, let there be ledger," he said. "Record feedings, sleep, ailments, any fool thing that shows this boy is tended." He thumped the book down. "Paper against paper. We'll see which stack holds." Lydia took the book like a deaconess takes a hymnal. "I'll keep it honest." "That's how you keep it strong," Doc said, and left a small tin of carbolic as if it were gold. The next days broke themselves into chores. Lydia boiled linens and learned my goat's dispositions the way good mothers learn their neighbors' children patient and braced for nonsense. I strung new fence where the wash had bitten, dug a shallow diversion ditch, so the next rain would run where I told it. Eveline surprised all of us, mostly herself, by showing up at sunup with sleeves rolled and questions worth answering. "What does a kid need besides milk?" she asked. "Hands," I said. "And patience when milk's late." She nodded and put her hands where they were asked, chopping wood, hauling water, scrubbing soot off depot windows until her grief had something to push against besides people. At night she read aloud from her papers as if reciting curses that had to be heard to be broken. I learned the weight of the words guardian, consanguinity, best interest. The law can be a fine lariat when you throw it clean. It can also be a garrote if you like the way folks turn quiet. On the fourth day, the newspaper from Prescott arrived, damp from the bag and already mean. The headline set its hat on me: Scout's Shadow, Elias Boone and the Calhoun Canyon Affair. Somebody who hadn't been there remembered it for me: how a freighter took a bullet under a moon hard as old bone, how a woman's scream cut the canyon in two, how my rifle answered and a man didn't get up again. "Is it true?" Eveline asked, not unkind. "True enough to hurt when you touch it," I said. "Not the way they wrote it." Lydia didn't ask. She folded the paper tight, used it to start the morning's fire, and set the kettle on top of yesterday's accusations. There's a lesson in that. I knew what the story meant. It meant whispers along the bucket line, sideways glances in the mercantile. Some men deciding my moral arithmetic added up to less than zero. The law is made of people, and people carry papers in their heads they never show you. I went to see Sheriff Harlan because I prefer my troubles measured. "Can you stand up to the noise?" he asked. "I can stand up to the weight of my own hand," I said. "Noise ain't heavier than truth, just louder." "You may need to put that truth in a room with a judge," he said. "Not today. Maybe soon." I rode home slow. A hawk cut circles over the wash. Down at the house, Lydia had the ledger open, printing neat as fence posts. 10 a.m. fed, 12:35 p.m. slept, 2:05 p.m. laughed. The smallness of it made me feel big enough to be useful. Eveline watched me cross the yard. "The article?" "Bad wind," I said. "Blows over when it finds a mountain." "Are you the mountain?" "Depends which side you're on," I said, and set to sharpening the shovel like a man rehearsing for winter. That night, the wind swung north. You can hear north when it comes. The boards tighten. The stove ticks like a watch, trying to keep pace with cold. I put an extra log on, pulled the quilt over the sleeping boy, and stepped onto the porch. The stars were spilled salt. Somewhere a cow bawled for a calf already butchered. We live with our choices out here. The sky makes sure we don't forget. I told Lydia the Calhoun story the way a man tells it to himself when he can't put it down. A woman yelled, I said. A boy yelled with her. I shot the only man with a gun out. He would have shot me if I were slower. I don't sleep softer for it, but I don't take it back. She listened like the mountain listens to wind, without comment, without hurry. Then you're the sort of man who comes when a child cries, she said. I'll keep that in the ledger under character. On the 7th day, we carried our ledger and our faces into town for the meeting the new schoolmaster called. William Harper had the kind of energy you usually only see in cults and revival preachers. He drew a blackboard out of nowhere and wrote, "A school is a promise." Then he set a tin on a stool and called it the treasury. We need slates, chalk, a stove that doesn't sulk, and a roof that pretends to be new, he said. We will take coin and also nails, labor, and miracles. He looked at me. Mr. Boone, if you can spare a Saturday with a hammer, I'll turn that into Sundays full of reading. He looked at Lydia and Eveline. "And I want the smallest pupil." He nodded toward Josiah. "He can sit in the corner and learn what a room full of hope sounds like." The room laughed in a way that made room for tears. Even Sheriff Harlan's mustache considered smiling. After, behind the church, Eveline pinched the bridge of her nose. "I don't know how to be the villain in a town where the children wave at me," she said. "You're not the villain," Lydia said. "You're the aunt with the hard question. What's the answer?" "Keep asking it out loud where we all can hear," I said. "Villains prefer quiet." On the 9th day, the railroad sent notice about the freight shed. Somebody had to pay for what the fire took and the water ruined. The somebody was everybody, which is another way to say no one. I cut a deal to haul ties for 5 days come spring in exchange for them forgetting my name. Eveline paid for glass at the depot without saying so in public. Lydia traded 20 hours of washing for 12 quarts of goat feed. That's a town debts braided into a rope strong enough to pull you through winter. Evening of the 9th day, a rider I didn't recognize came up fast with his hat lashed down and his jaw set. He was the kind that makes dust look like an accomplice. "Letter for Miss Brennan," he said, and would have tossed it if I hadn't reached and taken it civil. Eveline opened it on the porch. Her face did not change, which is its own kind of change. "Prescott judge moved up the hearing," she said. "Weather's good. Docket's thin. Day after tomorrow." "Then we ride tomorrow," I said. "All 3. 4, Lydia said, her hand on the sling. 5, Doc Talbot said from my gate. I hadn't seen him, but he had seen more than enough of us. If paper wants proof, it will meet it. We left at first light, the sort creatures with sense prefer. The world before dawn is a smaller place, and it's easier to see what matters, because there's less of everything else. I carried my rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because I respect it. Eveline rode straight back like she was going to argue a treaty. Lydia rode with the patience of a woman who knows the distance between a crying fit and peace is measured in minutes, not miles. Prescott sat neat against its hills like a banker's ledger, black lines, red lines, every number asking to be balanced. The courthouse smelled of varnish and last week's fights. We took a bench. The judge came in with a face like a winter road, serviceable, unamused. There's no point repeating all the words. Eveline's lawyer stacked phrases until the table sagged. Consanguinity, stability, resources. Doc stacked facts like firewood weight, teeth, color of the boy's laugh. Lydia spoke quiet, the way you load a wagon without breaking the axle. She did not cry. She did not gild. She laid out days like fence posts. Feed, rock, wash, sing. She said a thing that made the room put its hands in its lap. He sleeps with one hand open because he knows I'm there to hold it. The judge looked at me. Mr. Boone, are you kin? No, Your Honor. I am neighbor and witness. What is your interest? In the boy? That he grows up with a spine and a place to put his hat, I said. In the women? That they get to keep the work they've already done. The judge leaned back. What about the Calhoun Canyon affair? I met his eyes. A woman called for help, and I answered with the tools I had. If you wish to hang me for that, do it quick so the child can eat on time. Somebody in the back coughed a laugh into a handkerchief. The judge's mouth might have known how to smile once before the war. He shuffled papers like they were leaves he didn't trust. Then he did a thing that felt like weather changing. Court finds no cause to disturb the child's present placement at this time, he said. Aunt may petition for visitation and may render support without prejudice. He glanced at Eveline. I encourage the aunt to discover whether blood can learn to be humble, and the mother to discover whether humility can learn to accept help. Review in 6 months. Eveline bowed her head. If it was defeat, it was the kind people can live with. Lydia closed her eyes briefly, and I saw a whole winter blow across her face and leave a little green behind. Outside, on courthouse steps worn by everybody's boot leather, we stood in air that didn't belong to anyone. Eveline folded the judge's orders and tucked them like a letter from an old friend. She looked at Lydia. May I buy my nephew a blanket for the ride home? You may ride beside him and keep the wind off his face, Lydia said. Blankets we have. Windbreaks are rarer. We camped that night by a stand of cottonwoods where the roots go down like prayers. The fire was small and disciplined. Josiah dreamed with both hands open for once. Eveline told a story about Thomas when he was 10. How he had cut school to run along the harbor and count masts. How she had found him by the sound of his counting. He thought numbers could keep a ship from leaving, she said. He was wrong. Ships leave, I said. Some come back. Do men? Sometimes, I said, and meant the kind who leave without packing. We reached Ash Fork at noon next day with the judge's words in a pocket and something like a treaty in our mouths. The depot windows gleamed because Eveline had made them. The freight shed wore its black like a scar you learn to live with. William Harper was chalking letters on a board set up outside so every child had to trip over an alphabet before they could reach trouble. Eveline swung down and looked east, where the tracks ran away into country that used to be her whole story. I will stay a while, she said. I find I am not finished learning the language here. Start with supper, I said. Then tomorrow we talk roofs. That night after the dishes, after the ledger's last lines, after Josiah made that peaceable sound people make only before they know of taxes and graves, Lydia stepped out under the spill of stars. I followed because some silences asked to be kept by two. I kept thinking I was too late, she said. Too late for a husband, too late for a family, too late to be anything but careful. But this boy didn't ask me how late I was. He just asked if I'd stay. Staying's the only thing that beats the clock, I said. Everything else it eats. She faced me then, straight like a fence line that's been checked twice. Mr. Boone Elias, what do you want? 3 things I can say out loud, I told her. A fence that holds, a roof that doesn't lie, and to be the kind of man a boy copies without needing to pretend. She didn't step closer. She didn't step away. She let the night hold the rest for us. Winter came slow that year, patient as mercy. Frost wrote lace on the windows. Josiah took his first steps between Lydia's hands and mine, both of us laughing like we'd just discovered gravity. Eveline stayed through Christmas, teaching the schoolmaster's class until her handwriting softened into the land's rhythm. Sometimes I still wake before dawn and step out to the porch. The desert breath steams against my beard, and I hear the small stir of life behind me, Lydia humming low, the boy whispering in sleep, Eveline's cough softened by quilts. The horizon glows faint and amber, same as the inside of a church lamp. It's quiet then, the kind of quiet that asks nothing, just waits to see if you've learned. And I think, maybe this is what redemption sounds like: wood settling, goats shifting in their pens, a woman turning in her sleep, the earth holding still long enough for a man to forgive himself. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The Weight of Winter. First person, Elias Boone. Winter puts its hands on a man's shoulders different than summer. Where summer asks for sweat, winter asks for proof. The first storm came mean and dry, the kind that doesn't boast it, just arrives and stays, like a relative with opinions. The clouds rolled down from the high ridges in a single gray animal, tail dragging snow behind it, belly full of wind. By dusk the world had gone quiet except for the creak of our door and the slow complaint of trees remembering how to bend. We hung blankets over the door and moved the cradle nearer the stove. I taught Lydia the way juniper burns hot and fast with a pitch that spits, the way oak holds a coal like a grudge and gives it back generous. The fire spoke its own language, a grammar of pop and hiss, and after a while we learned to answer in silence. Eveline learned mittens. The first pair she knit looked like she was mad at the yarn. By the third, a man could put his hand in and come out with all the same fingers he went in with. She read to Josiah from newspapers until the words softened, and he answered back with syllables that sounded like tomorrow trying out its teeth. The boy's laugh filled the cabin the way light fills a cup left on the sill. Work changes people faster than sermons. Lydia's wrists found new muscle. Her back learned the theology of lifting. Sometimes she sang half under her breath, half to the kettle, and the tune stitched itself into the day. She laughed too, the kind of laugh a house can live off for a week. It is a strange thing to want to build a life where you once only planned to shelter for a night. Strange, and correct. Outside, the world narrowed. Snow pinned the landscape flat, and sound traveled so far you could hear your own thinking. The goats huddled close and muttered their complaints. At dusk, frost climbed the windows like scripture no one had translated yet. I'd wipe a small circle clear to watch the horizon breathe. The sun, even dying, had stubbornness left in it. The town brought its petitions like weather. Mrs. Henderson's boy with a cough that had to be argued with, a mare foaling in a cold snap, William Harper asking if I could turn 2 old wagon wheels into a reading circle. We were busy enough to forget dread except in the middle of the night, when dread likes to visit. That's when you hear the rafters stretch, the coyotes debate distance, and your mind rehearse all the wrong turns it ever took. Bad news comes on feet, you know. The freighter Jim Pike rode in white-faced with a letter from the paper, the same hand that had strung me up in ink before. They wanted a statement. The scout explains himself. I declined, by the useful method of forgetting to answer, until the urge to be understood passed. There's no peace in polishing old grief for strangers. What I didn't decline was the school roof. William and I pried the old shingles loose like Truth Prize pried. The nails had rusted into the wood, as if refusing to leave. Lydia brought coffee, and didn't hover. Eveline measured planks with a tailor's eye, and proved Boston understands angles, same as Arizona. By sundown, the place had a new hat, and the smell of fresh pitch mixed with cold air like an argument finally settled. The children clapped like they'd been given a holiday when what they'd been given was simply safety. We ate stew at my table that night, 4 chairs, 1 high stool for a small king. Josiah banged a spoon and called it music. Eveline smiled, eyes half on the boy, half on a future she didn't trust yet. Lydia looked at me over steam, and there was a treaty in it too, one written on a man's skin and a woman's patience. When the billy goat went off his feed, I worried quiet. Goats are the arithmetic of a small place. Get the numbers wrong and everything else doesn't add. Doc Talbot came, declared it a stomach trying to do too much with what it had, same as men, and left tincture with a warning about dosing gentle. Go slow, he said. Everything living's got a reason for balking. You know. Storm 2 came wet and sincere. The wash rose not angry this time, just determined. It carried branches, the ghosts of fences, a tin pail that had once been ours. I walked the banks with a lantern and the kind of prayer without words. Coyotes yipped at the edge of the circle and thought better of it. I breathed into my scarf until frost gave up trying to take me head first. We almost got through winter clean. Almost. It was the last cold week, the one that likes to remind you who's in charge before spring arrives, wearing white like it invented innocence. Josiah burned with a heat no stove knows. His little chest worked like a man pumping a dry well. Lydia's eyes got that bright, brittle look women get when terror has to sit down and do laundry. Doc, she said, and the word meant now. Doc came on a night horse that knew the way to my door without reins. He listened to the boy's lung. He said words like croup and watch him. He mixed steam with eucalyptus and told stories to keep Lydia from falling apart while the baby learned, slowly, to trade fight for breath. The kettle hissed, the fire muttered. Eveline sat knitting at the foot of the bed and praying with her mouth shut. The room smelled of wool, sweat, and willpower. It was a long night full of little victories that wouldn't impress a man who likes parades. One more breath, and one more, and after that, another. I went out twice to split wood because some battles prefer you give them the courtesy of a fresh log. The second time I leaned my head against the post and told the dark I was available to trade anything I had for the small boy inside. The dark didn't answer, it rarely does. But when I went back in, Josiah's lungs had decided they preferred their work to mine. He slept with his hand open again and kept it that way. Men pretend relief is a dry business. It isn't. It's wet and embarrassing, and you mop it up before the women see. Lydia saw anyway, and didn't say a word that would make it worse by making it better. She just rested her forehead against my chest for 3 seconds that changed the geography of the house. In the morning, the boy ate with the appetite of 7 men, and Doc said the word mending like a benediction. Lydia wrote in the ledger, lived. That was all. Sometimes the smallest handwriting carries the most gospel. Winter didn't end that day, but it began to negotiate. The air lost its bite. The hills showed hints of bone where snow slid off. Eveline took to reading on the porch wrapped in 2 blankets, pretending the sun had strength enough to keep promises. I caught her more than once smiling at the sight of Lydia and the boy, though she'd cover it quick with the same hand that once signed court papers. Spring crept in like a polite thief and left green where it could get away with it. The school opened with a bell that had belonged to a cow once and now belonged to learning. William Harper let Josiah sit under his desk and bang things so long as he didn't bang letters out of shape. Eveline started something she refused to call a charity, and everybody else called sense-buying flour in bulk. When the train price dipped and wholesaling it out at cost to the widows who smiled at the word dignity as if it were a new brand of coffee, I came to understand a thing I'd forgotten. A town is a kind of marriage, and the vows are work, mercy, and pie at funerals. People don't sign them, they just show up again tomorrow. Trouble doesn't let you feel too smart for too long. A rancher west of us lost a steer to theft, then 2. The trail pointed toward Ash Fork, and then pretended it didn't. I read sign the way some men read the Psalms. I don't always believe what's written, but I respect the rhythm. The ground told a story. Hoof prints where they shouldn't be. A spur rowel mark shaped like regret. I found where a horse with a split shoe had favored his off-fore, and a man had rolled a cigarette and left the match head near a salt bush. I found the place the thief had watched our school roof go up and decided the town was busy enough not to look behind itself. I told Harlan I'd ride the ridge. Lydia told me to come back with all the same holes I left with. Eveline did not tell me to be careful. She brought out the good coffee without comment, which is a Boston way of chanting protection spells. The trail led through ground I knew by scar and scent. Snow lingered in shadows like unpaid debt. By noon I found the man near Calhoun Canyon, because ghosts like to invite company. He had the look of a drifter who once believed in a boss and now believed in hunger. His coat was military cut, blue turned gray by weather. We did not stand on ceremony. When a thief notices he's been noticed, there's a window no bigger than your hand to talk. I put my rifle down first. He stared at the gesture as if it were a riddle. "I don't want your blood," I said. "I want your horse to forget the road to our corrals." He laughed because laughter is cheaper than surrender. Then he stopped laughing because that kind of laugh eats itself. "You Boone? Some days. You shot a man who wasn't yours to shoot." He was shooting at a woman who wasn't his to scare. He spat. "Same newspaper told me to come this way. Said your town was soft." "Paper don't know the difference between a calf and a cow in the dark," I said. "We're not soft. We're busy." Busy turned out to be enough. He let the reins go the way guilty men do when they've kept too much rope. Harlan met me at the canyon mouth and tied the rest. We brought the man in quiet and put him in the same cell that once held a choir of drunk miners. The town slept better because justice resembles a bed when it's done right. I went home to a stew I did not deserve, and a ledger I had forgotten Lydia kept. On one page she'd written, "Owed. One safe return." I asked her if she wanted it paid. "Not tonight," she said, and smiled like peace at the end of a long argument. The thaw came all at once. Snow fell from the roof in clumps, big enough to startle hens. The creek began to talk again, low, secretive, like someone remembering a story too tender to tell loudly. Lydia opened every window in the house, even though the air still had teeth. Eveline took to baking bread so often the whole yard smelled like forgiveness. Sometimes I'd come in from the barn and find flour on her cheek, like proof of redemption taking physical form. One morning Josiah came running in with a bird cupped in his hands. "He fell," he said. The bird blinked at me, insulted but alive. "So did we," I told him. "Only difference is we remembered to get up." He looked at me like I'd just told him the answer to something large. Maybe I had. By April, color came back to the valley. The ridges wore snow in the shadows and sunlight everywhere else. The fields took on that faint, impossible green that exists only for a week before turning practical again. We started patching fences, counting seed, sharpening blades. Life, after all, is just the practice of readiness. William organized a Sunday picnic on the meadow behind the school. He brought his fiddle, Eveline her pies, and Lydia her laughter. Josiah and the other children raced the creek, falling more than they ran. For a while, watching them, I forgot how much the world had cost to reach this quiet. Later that evening, when the others went home, Lydia and I stayed by the water. The last light stretched itself thin across her face. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every man thinks about it," I said. "But only the foolish ones do." She nodded, skipping a stone that made 4 skips before surrendering. "Then I guess we're staying foolish together." Oh. That night, the stars were sharp as new nails. The town slept easy, firelight flickering behind curtained windows. I sat at the table, oil lamp low, and wrote a single line on the back of a torn envelope. "This place survived winter. Maybe I can too." The ink blotted in one corner like a small confession. When I put out the light, I saw Lydia turn in her sleep, one arm reaching toward the empty half of the bed until it found me. I let her hand stay. The weight of it was small but real, the kind that holds a man to the earth when all the old ghosts start whispering. Outside, the wind changed its mind. It came from the east, soft and smelling faintly of rain mixed with something like promise. In that half-awake hour between night and dawn, I listened to the timbers breathe, the cradle creak, the faint sigh of the stove cooling. Winter had left its mark, but so had we. Tomorrow, I'd ride out to check the fence near the ridge, maybe fix a rail, maybe just breathe where the land widens and lets a man think straight. Either way, I'd come home before dark. The wind would be waiting, and the house would remember me by the sound of my boots. And that's how spring began. The Reckoning Fire. First person, Elias Boone. Summer came with that dry click you hear when a match thinks about lighting. Grass turned the color of old soldiers' coats. Men got short with each other over nothing, because heat is a rumor that your patience believes too fast. By mid-June, the ground itself felt like a held breath. I could hear fence wire sing in the afternoons, a thin metal note that meant both the posts and the men who set them were stretched. The air carried old smells, creosote, dust, iron, stirred together into one syndrome called summer. I kept a bucket by the door the way some folks keep a Bible, because both water and scripture cure things pride cannot. The railroad men stacked new ties by the siding for a spur that might be funded next year, and might be a story we told our grandchildren about almost. The ties smelled of tar and promise. The boys climbed them until mothers scolded, which is the natural rhythm of progress. William Harper swore he could teach logic using nothing but a freight schedule and a pile of timber. I told him logic was what a man did when he ran out of hunch. Eveline received a letter whose wax said Boston and whose handwriting said man accustomed to being obeyed. Her partner wanted her back, with flattery where leverage used to be. I watched her read it twice, and then feed it to my stove. The flame took it like a hymn, and ended it in one verse. She watched ash float and said nothing anybody could be wrong about. Later she stacked plates with unusual gentleness, which told me the letter had cracked some old ice but not enough to flood us. William Harper's pageant went off with more pride than accuracy, which is the correct ratio. Josiah wore a cap that insisted he was a brakeman and saluted anyone with a mustache. Lydia made lemonade that convinced half the town they were loved by God. I hammered steaks until the sun told me to stop, and then hammered one more. In the heat, a man gets stubborn. Sometimes that's morality in disguise, and sometimes it is just foolishness wearing boots. We had peace for almost a month. Peace is greedy. It wants you to forget it's on loan. The freight agent stored blasting powder wrong again because some men can only learn once, and some lessons refuse to be offered twice. I smelled it before I knew it, the metallic flat note that rides under summer like a snake. Doc says the nose is the oldest judge we've got. Mine rendered a verdict in the time it takes for a match to make up its mind. Before I reached the siding, the shed went to fire with a sound like a judge dropping a gavel in a thunderstorm. Sparks took the roof, then the wind put a hand behind them and said, "Go on, son." The bucket line formed because we are a people who line up when told. I took the corner nobody wanted and found the drum nobody remembered. It bulged like a belly that had eaten too much pressure. "Clear!" I yelled, and no one moved because courage is often deaf. I grabbed William by the collar and threw him 2 feet left, which probably saved his Latin career. Lydia had already put Josiah in the schoolhouse cellar and returned with that look that gets wars won and men married. Her hair had slipped loose and collected smoke the way a shawl collects rain. She handed me a wet sack, and we joined the human river pass, throw, until arms forgot they were separate from will. Eveline arrived like an apology for every harsh word she had set loose in the last 30 years. She took command of the small jobs, the ones that assemble themselves into life. Move the wagon, fetch the cloths, keep the old man from running into his own regrets. She had no paper for that. She needed none. Between orders, she said please and thank you, in a voice that turned panic into arithmetic. The wind shifted. It always does at the wrong time. Fire carried a spark to the school roof we'd put on ourselves with our own will and a borrowed square. I felt a private grief like a man feels when someone says a true thing about his father. I started toward it. Lydia was already there. She went up the ladder like Grace going forward. Steady, without looking down. Wet, William shouted, and tossed her the sack. She beat at the place flame starts wars, the seam where new shingle meets old. Steam huffed. The sack darkened. The smoke thinned, sulking. She shifted her stance barefoot on tar paper, found her balance the way prayer finds its footing. Quietly, without audience. The roof failed to catch. All that effort for a negative no fire. I'll take 100 victories like that. Down by the siding, a beam cracked and threw chips like teeth. We worked without sentences for a while. Just elbows and lungs. On my 3rd pass, I felt the drum behind me argue with itself. Back, I barked. Nobody listened, which is a saint's habit and a fool's. I caught William's sleeve and yanked him past a broken cart. The drum let go in a sigh that canceled a wall. Boards flicked through the air. Nails learned to fly. I saw the piece headed for Lydia and chose a line I could live with. The board met my shoulder and drove splinters into the place I keep my bad temper. Sound folded for a second, the way a tent falls and then remembers its pole. I stayed on my feet because I prefer to fall where children can't see me. Lydia looked down from the roof with a face that drew 4 new lines and would not let them stay. Elias, she said. And somehow the old pain from Calhoun found room for the new and both quieted some. Doc got to me before pride could. Sit, he ordered. I did, mostly because the ground had started leaning. He plucked out splinters the way a man removes unhelpful words from a letter. You'll ride stiff a week, he said. Learn to let the boy climb up from the other side. He wrapped my shoulder tight enough to remind it about its job, but not so tight it forgot how to breathe. By sundown, the shed was a black opinion. The school stood. The town had its eyebrows singed, but not its future. Ash lay on everything like a cheap sermon, broad, gray, and tired of itself. We made a quick inventory. 6 blisters, 2 burns, 1 goat offended by smoke, no funerals. I said the only prayer I trust after fire, thank you, and I meant it like bread. That night the town ate beans the way men do when they've decided to keep living. The children were too excited to sleep. The old were too old to pretend they weren't. Eveline poured coffee for anyone with a hand and learned every gossip's first name by accident. Lydia washed my shoulder with a touch that wasn't owned by any paper. Hurt? She asked. Yes, I said, but not where I can't work. She tied the last knot with a neatness that belonged to both of us. Later, under the same stars that had watched earlier fires on earlier prairies, and will watch later ones long after we're folded into our ground, I opened the little box that had held cartridges. Inside was a ring worked from a Mexican coin, the kind a camp blacksmith makes on a Sunday when his hands need to do tenderness or they will do harm. The edges showed where a file had taught it to be gentle. I don't promise peace, I said. I promise presence. I don't promise ease. I promise bread and wood and a hand at night. She didn't let me finish because sometimes the right answer respects the economy of a yes. Then take mine, she said, and brought out a ribbon with her mother's ring tied on. And keep it against your bad temper. She slipped the coin band onto my finger and tested the fit the way a carpenter tests a joint, by trusting it with weight. The rings shone dull in starlight. We didn't make speeches because we are poor and poor folk hoard words. We stood. We let the night write the certificate. Dawn arrived without ceremony. I woke to the legal complaint of a rooster and the illegal complaint of my shoulder. Lydia was already up, quiet the way competence is. Josiah marched a wooden train along the table toward a cup of water that was pretending to be Denver. Eveline wrote a list headed, "Things we can save." Under it she put, "More than you think." We ate biscuits that tasted like survival, too hard on the edges, warm in the middle, improved by company. The days that followed weren't peace, but something better. Motion with purpose. The fire had taken more than wood, it had burned away excuses. Men rebuilt the siding in the sun, sweat cutting rivers through their dust. Every nail set was a small oath. The women patched clothes, scrubbed what could be saved, and sang like they meant to remind the world it hadn't beaten them yet. We learned again how quick human hands can be when the future is pointed at them. The freight agent blamed properly and loudly stood aside and let Sheriff Harlan write the kind of report that makes a railroad spend money like it just discovered shame. "Safe storage," the sheriff said, "or I'll store you." His mustache agreed in bold strokes. William organized a fundraiser, though no one had much money to raise. Children sold lemonade, and old men told stories for nickels they refused to keep. A fiddler from up the wash set his hat on the ground and played reels until babies clapped at time itself. Eveline baked 20 pies and then started on more, saying, "The secret to economy is pretending it's generosity." She sold her pies for whatever coins people had and for a promise from those who had none. By week's end, the new roof stood higher than the old one. Progress always wants to see over the last fire. The morning we finished, the town gathered without being told. The bell rope had burned, so Lydia climbed the beam and tied a new one herself. Her dress caught the sun like an answer. She tested the knot with a tug a sailor would respect. When she pulled, the bell's voice cracked once, and then found its pitch. Sound carried through the valley, rolling off the rim and back like applause. Doc called it the healthiest noise he'd ever heard. William wrote perseverance on the school slate and let the children sound it out like they were learning their own names. Josiah saluted the bell and informed it he was in charge of trains. The bell forgave him. That evening I sat on the porch steps while Josiah turned the dirt with a stick, pretending to farm. A breeze moved across the yard the way a hand smooths a blanket. Lydia came out with coffee, her hair loose from the day's work, some strands smoky, some gold, all of it honest. We didn't talk about the fire. We didn't need to. Sometimes survival is its own conversation. The air smelled of pine pitch and forgiveness. "Does it hurt?" she asked, touching the bandage beneath my shirt like the question itself might remove a splinter. "Enough to remind me I'm not done learning," I said. She smiled at that small true. "Then I hope we stay slow learners a long while." We watched the last light collect under the cottonwoods like coins in a church plate. Somewhere down by the siding, a tune drifted up fiddle and mouth harp, out of key and perfect. I could feel the town's beat aligning again. Hammer, broom, ladle, pen, no parade. Just a cadence of ordinary decency. That's what passes for glory this far from courthouses. Later, the rains came late but steady, fat drops tapping against the tin roof we'd earned. In that rhythm, I heard the pulse of a town beginning again. I held Lydia's hand and thought how love, like weather, doesn't ask if you're ready, it just arrives and expects you to learn its seasons. Through the window, I watched Eveline draft a letter on proper paper, the expensive kind that makes a sentence behave. She wrote to Boston, declined with gratitude. Then she underlined with and smiled, like a verdict. In the morning, the town behaved like it always does. After a decision, it went to work. Children practiced letters. William rewired pride into the alphabet. Sheriff Harlan telegraphed his report so hard the key squeaked. The railroad wired back the next day, promising new safety lockers and a foreman who knew the difference between storage and a funeral pyre. Eveline found a house in town and didn't rent it. She bought it because she had decided future was not a rumor. She paid partly with money, partly with a Boston glare, and partly with pies. The deed clerk took all three forms of currency. There was one task left that men of my stamp know you can't skip. I rode back to Calhoun Canyon with Harlan and told the rocks out loud what the judge in Prescott already knew. The canyon worked at memory the way wind works at a bone polishing, thinning, refusing to forget. I stood by the spot where a freighter had bled years into stone and said the only version of confession that helps me. I shot a man once because a woman yelled, "If there is a price I have not yet paid, send me the bill." The wind wrote paid in dust across my boots. Harlan said nothing, which was mercy. We rode home. The wedding happened the way a Western wedding ought. Too much pie, a ring that doesn't fit quite right because hands swell after work, a hymn sung by people who can't hold a tune but can hold a neighbor upright when sorrow comes. We stood by the schoolhouse because the bells sounded like blessing. William said a few words stolen from the Romans because he believes in old Italian advice. "Rejoice with those who rejoice," he said, and then misquoted something on purpose because accuracy can be cruel and joy can't. Doc coughed at all the right moments. Eveline cried and then denied it with Boston efficiency, which means she blamed the wind, and everyone agreed to believe her. Sheriff Harlan pretended the brim of his hat needed study. Josiah presented us with a drawing of a train, a house, and a pair of rings bigger than the Sunday. He said he'd conduct us to supper. We followed as ordered. When the sun dropped behind the rim and the choir of crickets tuned up, I danced a way I haven't since a barn in Missouri before the war. My shoulder lodged a complaint and then withdrew it. Lydia laughed once into my collarbone, and I put that sound away where I keep ammunition. Some men keep keepsakes in drawers. I keep mine where the rifle once sat to remind me what power is for. We went home to our two-room kingdom and found that marriage smells like soap and wood smoke and someone else's hair beside your face. Josiah refused to sleep because he had not been asked enough questions by the day. We asked him some more. He wanted to know if trains sleep, if bells dream, if goats pray. We told him yes. All three, because truth for the very young is not about facts, but about loyalty. He surrendered around the third, yes. Later, with a house empty of footsteps, we unrolled the maps. No court keeps promises a man and woman draw between stove and bed and door. We marked rivers called sickness and doubt, bridges named work and please, harbors labeled home. We agreed to keep the ledger honest, and the firewood split ahead of the weather. The future fitted itself around us like a coat cut by someone who liked his work. The morning after, light came in polite through the east window. We ate fried eggs, 2 for me, 1 for Lydia, 1 rejected by a goat and adopted by a skillet standing because chairs seemed too formal for a life as new as ours. I walked the fence line with a mug in my hand and my ring getting used to the business of being permanent. A hawk hauled a shadow across the pasture and set it down again, which is hunting, and also the definition of adulthood. Work met me right where I'd left it. A rail out past the wash had let go of its duty. I reset it with a grunt the goats respected. From the ridge I could see the siding new roof, shining the way healed skin shines before the sun turns it ordinary. On the road a rig moved slow, a widow with 3 kids and too much luggage, bound for her sister's house outside Ash Fork. I tipped my hat. The oldest boy tipped back, dropped his hat, chased it with the seriousness reserved for hats and vows. Their wheels cut twin lines in dust that a wind would erase, but not memory. By noon the heat returned the dry click at the edge of every thought. In town, the pageant stage was already being cannibalized into shelves, because boards must always become the next necessary thing. Eveline, now mistress of a small white house with a blue door and a grapevine that believed in miracles, set a basin on her stoop and washed her new threshold like it had rescued her. Lydia sent over a jar of beans as dowry and a note that read, "For your larder and your quiet." Eveline stuck the note into her Bible, which is Boston for amen. Toward evening, Sheriff Harlan rode up slow, hat brim low. That sort of entrance can carry 2 kinds of news. He let me choose by staying quiet. I poured him coffee, which is the local ceremony for courage, and waited. "Railroad wired," he said. "New foreman arrives next week. Proper lockers, powder off station grounds. We get a stipend for the school, too. Seems our report read like scripture in the right ears." "Lowen." "Good," I said. "I'd rather our next fire be a cooking one." He nodded. "One more thing." He took an envelope from his vest, Boston wax again. My name on it, not Eveline's. Inside was a letter from the law firm that once thought it could thread a needle through our family. The letter said case closed, said visitation at aunt's discretion, said the sort of tidy phrases men invent to avoid the raw words that build a life. I handed the page to Lydia. She read it once and looked at me across a room that had somehow grown wider without moving. "We were already living this," she said. "Paper likes to arrive late to its own party," I said. That night we turned the new bell ourselves, 3 slow pulls. The sound traveled into hills that had watched us be strangers and would now watch us argue gently about paint colors and seed varieties. After supper we walked to Eveline's house with extra bread. She opened the door with flour on her hands and victory on her face. We didn't mention the letter. We ate on crates. We spoke about shelf heights, gutters, and the way grapevines refuse to obey maps. The talk that proves a town is not just structures, but a grammar of kindness. When the moon was up, I took the long way home past the siding. The rebuilt walls smelled of pitch and apology. I stood where the drum had sighed and touched the new boards with the back of my hand. They were still warm from the day, and that felt fitting. Some places learn. Some men do, too. On our porch, Lydia leaned against the post like she'd always known it would hold her. "How's your shoulder?" she asked. "Argues in the afternoon," I said. "Makes a fair point, then quits." She took my left hand, the one with the coin ring, and turned it so the moon had its say about silver. "You keep your promises," she said. "I try to keep the ones I'm strong enough for," I said. "The rest I keep with help." She nodded at the house where Josiah slept with his train and a crust of bread he'd refused to give up even to dreams. "You have help," she said. We went inside and closed the door against a breeze that had started to talk politics with the curtains. The stove ticked in that shy way iron does after a day's work. I banked the coals. The room held the smell of coffee and rope and the clean wool of a good blanket, the liturgy of ordinary nights. Sometime before sleep I thought about the fire we'd outrun and the ones we hadn't. I considered the drum that forgot humility and the bell that remembered purpose. I counted our debts in work and pies and small forgivenesses. Out here, a reckoning isn't the sheriff's book. It's a ledger written in calluses and names you say softly so the dark will approve. Summer kept its dry click at the edge of things. The grass held to its soldier color. Men still got short over nothing. But the town had learned a new trick. It stayed long on grace. The railroad would learn its own lessons, or we would teach it. The school roof turned rain into music. The bell had a new rope. We had rings that didn't match but agreed anyway. And in my pocket I carried a little folded square of paper, Lydia's first list as wife, which read, "Bread, kerosene, nails enough, time for reading, patience for heat." I added one line in pencil that night before we slept, and more water by the door, because summer is a long trial, and mercy, like a bucket, works best when you keep it where you can reach it. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Open country, open hearts. First person, Elias Boone. Fall again. The rim breathed cold down our collars in the morning and forgiveness by noon. The light turned copper on the edges of cottonwoods, and boots began to sound different on the boards, less slap, more thought. Ash Fork had learned new habits. The school bell that refused to quit, a depot with glass that could see its own reflection, a freight shed rebuilt with care, and a healthy respect for powder. Even the wind seemed to read our posted notices before it tried the doors. Lydia taught letters on Thursdays to women who had never been offered them. They came with babies on hips, flowers still on hands, and the look of people who've been told reading is a luxury like lace. She started with names the kind a woman writes for herself, not one a husband writes for her. Maria Ruthenid. By the second Thursday, a few were writing the names of their dead softly on scrap paper and pressing the page to their chest like a clean cloth against an old bruise. Lydia said the sound a quill makes on cheap paper could sand a soul smooth if you kept at it. Eveline ran her flower and dignity scheme, with the kind of bookkeeping that makes bankers cry from envy and never admit it. She'd pencil columns labeled cost, carry, credit, kindness, and pretend the last one had a number you could balance. When a widow tried to pay with a brooch shaped like a swallow, Eveline put it on and called it interest and told her to bring back a story instead. She kept the ledgers neat and the front step swept. She said both were forms of mercy. William started a library made of 6 books and the promise of 7. He tucked them into a cabinet he'd stolen from a retiring dentist and labeled the shelves with chalk: history, poems, a good lie or two. A boy asked what the last one meant, and William said, "Fiction, true things, wearing better shoes." I believed him because I've seen a parable outride a bullet. I put up a lean-to that decided to be a classroom when the wind consented. We roofed it with tin and bravado, whitewashed the inside with lime that got into my beard and made me look wise by accident. Josiah learned to outrun his shadow and then learned to wait for it when it didn't want to be left. He called me Pa one evening over stew as if he'd been practicing in his sleep and found courage at supper. When a boy names you, the house changes shape to fit the word. We took a wagon up Sycamore to find a patch of ground where the grass speaks in June and the rocks stay where you put them. I drove. Lydia rode the brake with her foot because she is a student of gravity, and Eveline counted clouds in case the weather forgot to. The wheels talked their slow syllables over roots. Jays heckled us with the confidence of spectators who don't build anything. The smell of sycamore leaves green turning to paper hung under the rim like a curtain gathered for a show the country puts on every year, whether you buy a ticket or not. Midway we stopped by the cottonwoods where the roots drink old stories. I walked off 10 squares with the kind of seriousness only a fool or a farmer brings to dirt. "Here," I said, "schoolhouse." Lydia looked at the horizon like a verdict coming back. "And a porch? Big enough for 3 rocking chairs and arguments," I said. Eveline shaded her eyes and pretended not to blink away wet. "I can see him reciting," she said, nodding at Josiah, who was occupied with the important science of making a stick write his name in dust without knowing letters for it yet. When he finished his masterpiece circles that meant everything to him, he held the stick up like a diploma. We built that school with no permit but every permission that matters. Men hammered. Women decided where the light ought to fall. Children hauled nails with the gravity of saints handling relics. William wrote mercy over the door in chalk, because paint would have made it vain. Lydia measured desks by forearm and quill, not catalog. Eveline organized sandwiches like a quartermaster of kindness. The bell rope smelled of tar and winter. We tied it hard, the way vows are tied when no one has money for fancy knots. Midway through the work, under a sky that had borrowed its blue from the boy's eyes, I set my hammer down and looked at the town making itself useful. Lydia slipped her hand into mine with that economy of motion I cherish. She doesn't waste gestures. She spends them like coin on bread, never on confetti. A gust ran leaves across the porch and arranged them briefly into a map of everywhere we hadn't been. I told the wind we were busy here. It took the hint and moved on. When the school opened that September, the whole valley turned out. Women wore their Sunday calico. Men had the decency to wash their hats. The bell clanged wild and proud, as if eager to make up for years of silence. Josiah stood in the front row, his hair combed in defiance of gravity, his hands folded like he understood ceremony. Eveline sat behind him, hat pinned with a sprig of sage she claimed was for luck. Lydia stood at the door, straight-backed, eyes bright proud in a quiet way, the way rivers are proud after a flood. The children sang the only song everyone knew, half of it out of tune. That made it perfect. I said a few words that were mostly about nails and patience and the trick of starting on the straightest board you've got. William spoke about reading as a kind of frontier that never runs out of land. The map gets bigger when you learn the road to the next word, he said, and the smallest girl nodded like she'd been suspecting as much. When the bell rang again, no one moved right away. The sound hung in the dry air like a promise waiting for ink. Then we let the sound carry us forward into benches, into lessons, into a future that asked to be shouldered rather than admired. That winter came light and slow, like an apology. Snow lay thin across the ridge, just enough to make the town look freshly minted. Smoke rose straight, like a man telling the truth. For a while, everything felt easy. Eveline's store thrived. Her ledgers grew fat with both numbers and favors. Lydia's classes filled up with wives and widows who discovered that learning a word like liberty with your own tongue feels different than hearing a man say it for you. I saw their faces when they first wrote "I can" careful strokes, opening into something that had been trying to hatch for years. But the West doesn't let comfort sit too long. Come April, the rain forgot us. The creek shrank, the well turned stingy, and the grass crisped underfoot. Dust gathered on everything but complaints. People started watching clouds like gamblers studying dice. The drought tested our faith in each other more than in God. God forgives easily. Neighbors remember how you act at the pump. The first fight broke out over water at the north pasture. A rancher dammed the flow that fed the school garden, saying his cattle had seniority. William tried to reason, which works fine in books. I tried a different kind of reasoning. We walked the ditch together, counted the boards, measured fall and rise like it was a hymn with too many verses. Dawn and dusk, I said at last. Half and half. You take dawn. Children take dusk. The sun will hold both of us honest. He started to argue, then remembered the sound of the bell when his boy learned R from P. He nodded. Nobody smiled, but nobody drew. We wrote schedules on planks and nailed them up like commandments, not because wood can make men behave, but because it keeps the weak from being told they misremember. The ditch sloshed with our truce. The garden yellowed slow instead of quick. A small victory, but those are the ones that last. Lydia prayed for rain anyway. Every evening she'd walk out to the porch, Josiah at her side, and they'd tilt their heads to the blank sky. Maybe today he's just busy elsewhere, she'd say, and the boy would nod like that explained everything. Children don't need complex theologies. They need to see adults keep hope in working order. Eveline wrote letters to Prescott for seed and aid, wrapping each one in language polite enough to shame bureaucrats into humanity. She wrote, "The matter is urgent in the way bread is urgent." She wrote, "We keep receipts and our patience. Please honor both." The train brought barrels of flour, stenciled with the letters of a company that never planned to be noble. She rationed fare 1 scoop more where there were 4 children, 1 less where there was a roof that didn't leak. I hauled water from a spring 6 miles west, the kind of work that makes a man understand how little his back belongs to him. The mules put their heads down and did theology. 1 step, another, and praise after. The town endured, not happy, not hopeless, just enduring. It's not a word for poems, but it's the backbone for the posture of people who intend to outlast weather and gossip. The storm broke in July. You could smell it half a day before it came, the air thick with iron and expectation, a coolness hiding under your shirt like a good secret. The mountains to the south went from blue to bruise. We watched the ridge quiver with light, dry thunder rehearsing and waited. When the sky finally tore open, it didn't begin with drizzle, it began with a declaration. The first crack made a sound like a safe opening in a bank we had forgotten we owned. Rain came down like justice, late, fierce, and not asking permission. Kids danced barefoot in the mud until their mothers remembered they were supposed to scold them, and then remembered they were mothers first and scolds second. I stood in the street and let it hit my face, thinking how mercy sometimes arrives disguised as weather. Lydia came beside me, hair plastered, eyes laughing. "See," she said. "Told you he was just busy." We were wet past apology. It felt like repentance without shame. That night, with the ground steaming and the air smelling like new beginnings, the town gathered in the half-built church. Rafters held a darkness shaped like shelter. William played a hymn badly on his fiddle, and everyone sang badly right along. You can't sing drought well, you can only sing through it. Eveline cried outright, and nobody pretended not to see. She cried for the letters that worked and the flower that lasted, and for the women who now could sign for themselves. I realized then what we'd built wasn't just walls and roofs. We'd built belief, a fragile, working kind. The months after the rain were kind. The creek fattened, the crops greened, and the nights softened. Babies slept better. Men argued less at cards. Josiah learned to read whole pages without help, his voice steady and serious, as if each word were a small animal needing gentleness. "Pa," he'd say, climbing into my lap with his primer, "tell me what mercy means again." I told him mercy was when you give someone another chance because you remember being them once. He nodded like a clerk stamping approved. Eveline, who'd spent years measuring worth in ledgers, started a new column. Kindness owed. It never balanced. She said it wasn't supposed to. If the numbers ever come out even, she told me, we've miscounted. Lydia, meanwhile, began teaching at the new school full-time. She wore a blue shawl that Josiah claimed made her look like morning itself. Watching her in that classroom, head bent over a child's paper, light catching her hair, I thought maybe heaven isn't a place but a moment when everyone you love is within reach and concentrating. We tried a harvest fair that first good year after the drought. Pies judged under rules no one agreed to but everyone obeyed. A sack race where Sheriff Harlan fell, laughed, and handed his dignity to a boy to carry for him. William set up a table of books and traded paragraphs for pumpkins. Eveline raffled a quilt pieced from dresses that had outlived their sorrows. Lydia entered nothing, won everything, and said it was the luck of the shawl. One evening I rode out past the ridge alone. The land stretched ahead, rough and gold under the dying Sunday. From there I could see Ash Fork spread below tiny roofs, slow smoke, a thread of river glinting like a vein of silver. I thought of the man I used to be, riding scout for pay, measuring worth in miles and bullets. Then I thought of the boy sleeping under my roof, and the woman whose laugh could rebuild a man's courage faster than whiskey. The math came out even. I decided not to tell anyone. Some balances work better, kept quiet. By autumn, travelers started passing through more often. They'd stop at Eveline's for supplies and end up staying for supper. Word spread that Ash Fork was a town that didn't ask where you came from, only whether you meant to stay decent. A drummer from the east sold us tin whistles that made children bearable to each other. A tinker fixed 3 clocks and told us time in Denver ran nervous. Ours didn't. A woman with a scar told Lydia that reading had made her loneliness less efficient. Some came broke and left whole. Some left broke and didn't mind. We weren't heaven, just habitable. One stranger, a photographer from Denver, set up a black box in the schoolyard and took our picture. The sun was too honest. He shaded the lens with his hat and made us stand still longer than decency should require. We gathered in front of the building we'd raised with calloused hands. Lydia held Josiah. I stood behind them with my arm around both. Eveline refused to smile until the last second, then did, surprising even herself. William scowled on purpose, saying it would make future historians take him seriously. When the plate came back, the edges already considering yellow, we pinned it above the stove. Proof we'd once been young together, or at least braver than we felt. That winter, Eveline fell ill. Fever, slow and mean, the kind that walks in without knocking and sits in your best chair like it's earned the cushion. Doc came twice a day, his voice gentle but eyes telling the truth. He'd seen too many maps like this one. Lydia nursed her through nights that stretched like bad roads, spooning broth with a patience that could have moved mountains if mountains respected soup. I sat outside more than inside, carving small wooden animals for Josiah, because men like me don't pray well unless our hands are busy making something that won't shoot. One night Eveline called me in. Her skin was cool, her eyes bright like the desert before dawn. "Promise me," she whispered, "you'll keep her laughing. The boy too. Don't let the quiet win." I promised, which is stronger than a vow, if you intend to pay it in chores. She was gone by sunrise. We buried her under the cottonwoods near the school, the same spot she'd chosen years before without knowing. The town came mostly in work clothes because grief doesn't care for starch. William read from Corinthians, where it talks like a grown man about love, not failing even when bodies do. Lydia sang through tears, and the sound put a hand on every chest. Josiah placed his best marble on the mound because he said Aunt Ev liked shiny things, and he could practice sharing. The bench we set by her grave had a back smooth enough for the soft part of a palm. On it, William carved one word: mercy. No dates. Mercy lives better without fences. Spring came as if nothing had happened, which is how spring always comes, polite to the point of cruelty. Shoots pushed up through dirt that had recently known a spade for the wrong reason. Grief softened its edges in the rhythm of chores. Lydia's laughter returned, lighter now but real, the way water sounds when it finds its creek again. Josiah grew taller, hungrier, and started fixing things before I could tell him to. He once oiled the door hinges and told the house to try kindness for a week. The house obliged. The school thrived. The town thrived. Every Sunday, someone left fresh flowers on Eveline's bench. No one ever said who. Some weeks it was wild lupine. Some weeks it was geranium from a windowsill. Once it was sage in a neat bundle tied with blue thread. The good guess is that everyone took a turn and nobody wanted credit because grief, like rain, is best handled in common. Years slide quick when you're busy being alive. A summer of grasshoppers that taught children new swear words. A winter of ice, so honest even liars walked carefully. The rail spur finally funded, then delayed, then funded again, like a politician learning humility. The library grew to 9 books, and the promise of 10. William moved a good lie or 2 to 2 shelves and called it a curriculum. Lydia's Thursday class produced a woman who wrote her first letter to a brother in prison. She read it aloud to us on the porch, and the porch got bigger to hold it. One afternoon, while repairing the corral fence, I noticed Josiah's handwriting carved faint into a post. "Pa, I'll make you proud." He already had, but I didn't tell him. Some truths a man keeps quiet so they can keep growing. He's the sort who needs space to discover the obvious. So was I. Once, we hosted a wedding in the schoolyard one October, 2 people who had thought themselves too dented to be decent together. The bell rang them into promises, and the children threw leaves because rice was both scarce and hard on birds. I watched them kiss like a truce between counties and felt the town add a rib. Sometimes, late at night, I still walk out to the porch. The wind moves gentle through the grass, the stars bright enough to read by, if what you're reading is regret or gratitude. I think about how the land changed us not by kindness alone but by its insistence that we keep trying. I think about the strangers still on the road, looking for a town like ours, for a place that forgives, and I hope they find one or build one. Forgiveness is a franchise. If you've got patience for paperwork nobody else will file. The world beyond Ash Fork keeps spinning, inventing wars and machines and men who think they can out-talk the wind. A peddler showed us a device that makes music from a crank in a box. Josiah liked it until it broke, which took 3 songs. But here, the bell rings, children run, and the sky keeps its distance just right. If there's such a thing as peace, it's not loud, it's steady. It smells like bread cooling and horses sweating after work. It looks like a ledger with more names under helped than under owed. Sometimes travelers ask if I believe in God. I tell them yes, but mostly I believe in mornings that arrive even when we don't deserve them. I believe in the woman sleeping inside, and in the boy who will one day take this story farther than I ever could. And I believe in mercy, the kind that doesn't erase what was hard but makes it worth remembering. We took the photographer's picture down yesterday to dust it, and found behind it a small sketch Eveline had tucked there, 3 chairs on a porch, a schoolhouse, a distant line she'd labeled rim. Lydia put the photo back and kept the sketch in her book. "For dull days," she said, "though I don't think we've got many of those left." Toward evening the other day, we walked out to the north pasture. The ditch sang again, that practical hymn. The schedule board still showed dawn cattle, dusk garden. The rancher who'd fought us once stood there, hands in pockets, watching the water move. "You were right," he said without quite looking at me, "about the sun keeping us honest." I said nothing because I'd rather be wrong next time if it means he'll carry the lesson on his own back. The horizon still calls now and then, soft as a far train through cotton. Some days I answer with a longer ride to the rim, just to see how big the world insists on being. Most days I answer by tightening a hinge or splitting wood ahead of winter. I've learned not every man has to chase distance to feel free. Some of us are meant to stay and keep the light on for the next one lost in the dark. The boy, my boy, leaned his head into my shoulder last night and asked if mercy had a weight. "Yes," I said. "It's the exact weight of a hand on your back when you're trying to stand." He seemed satisfied with the math. He slept quick. I sat a while longer and listened to the country breathe, 2 owls trading news, a horse shifting, a coyote deciding against ambition. When I finally banked the stove and latched the door, I caught our reflection in the depot glass across the road, small, warm, stubborn, open country around us, open hearts within. If that's not a religion, it's close enough for the likes of us. Tomorrow I'll mend the fence by the sycamores. Lydia will lay out slates. William will argue with a poem. Children will run toward bells like bells are something new. And when dusk comes down the rim, the valley will glow as if forgiven all over again. We'll take it. We'll earn it. We'll pass it forward in bread, in books, in buckets of water carried level. And when some future traveler stops to ask directions, we'll point first to the road, then to the bench under the cottonwoods that remembers our best accountant of grace. If they sit and rest there, they'll see it as we do, a town that learned to keep going without hurrying, a country that made us honest, and a sky with room enough for the next mercy. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of the last West town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Nhớ lồng ghép các từ khóa cowboy love stories, Wild West love story, vào đoạn cuối, Duarn Kui Kungi. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, Amen, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.
He promised to meet me himself. I don't owe you. I choose you.
I know. You ever think about leaving?
I think about staying. That's new.
Arizona Territory, September 1881. The train had long pulled out, leaving the depot shuddering in its own heat. The timbers ticked and settled like they were remembering each nail that held them together. Dust hung in the air like regret that wouldn't settle. I could taste it, bitter as penny copper and as dry as a lie told twice. A poster flapped tiredly on a peeling post, a lost mule, a church supper, a territorial warrant already yellowing in the corners. Somewhere a loose shutter clapped once, twice, then gave up. I took it in the way a man takes a beating, one detail at a time. She sat on a crate near the platform, gloved hands folded, the edges of her dress gray from travel. The fabric might have once been blue. Now it held to that color only in the stubborn places, the creases near the buttons, a seam along her sleeve, the hem where it had been protected by the fold of her step. A carpet bag rested by her boots, and a folded letter peeked from her skirt pocket like it had been opened too many times to still believe in its words. Everything about her said not to look too hard. The tilt of the hat veil, the angle of her shoulders, the exact calm of someone balancing a full glass in a moving room. Her hat shaded half her face, but I could see the line of her mouth, the kind that had forgotten how to expect kindness and learned to close around silence instead. I reined in Jonah, my old gelding, and let him breathe. He stood like a wise creature does when the day asks too much of it, head low, ears relaxed, ribs rising slow. The saddle leather creaked the way old things talk to each other, soft, resentful, resigned. I slid my hand along his neck and felt the knot of sweat and effort there, the wordless loyalty of a beast who's carried more than his share without complaint. Heat unrolled off him and off the boards and off the very idea of the West. I took off my hat and the sun hit my hairline, and it felt like a brand reminding me of a name I'd tried to outgrow. For a moment I just looked the platform, the rails, the wind, and the woman who looked like she'd bet everything on a promise and come up short. There's a way the body holds itself when it's run out of places to set down the hurt. I knew it. I'd worn it. The day felt too bright for such a look. And that's how I knew it was honest. I dismounted slow. The spurs didn't jingle. They whispered. That's the sound of a man who's learned what noise can cost. One of the station dogs got up and trotted 2 steps as if to announce me, then lay down again after deciding I wasn't the kind of man anything good followed. The boards under my boots complained in old voices. I stopped a few paces from her so we could pretend neither of us needed anything from the other. She kept still, like a deer that's decided not to run because it finally learned there's nowhere to go. "Ma'am," I said. My voice came out rough, like boots on gravel. My throat wasn't ready for politeness. She didn't answer at first, just kept her eyes on the station wall as if someone might step out from it, someone late but welcome, someone carrying the other end of a decision too heavy for one pair of hands. The wind lifted the edge of her veil and laid it